Welcome to everybody. I'm pleased to open this morning session, and the title of the morning session is Frege and CANTOR in Badiou's Being and Event. Firstly, Nick Nesbitt will hold his paper. I would like to introduce him. Nick Nesbitt is a professor of French at Princeton University, and he works in Francophone studies, and his focus is to intellectual history of the Black Atlantic world, and simultaneously he is interested in many other topics such as political philosophy or Marx's labor theory of value, Louis Althusser, Alain Badiou, and quite mostly he edited the book The Concept in Crisis, Reading Capital Today, with contributions by Alain Badiou, Etienne Baliba, Warren Montag, Nick Nesbitt, and others. Nick adjusted the title of his presentation. The title is from logic to axiomatic, as you can see, Badiou, Marx, and the critic of Fregean idealism. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mikhail. Morning, everyone. It's a pleasure when in improvisation I switched the title. I figured that, in fact, really I wanted to talk about Badiou and Marx, and in the context of our discussion, I wasn't sure how that might play out. Well, still to be determined. But I think there are a lot of themes already from yesterday that I want to pick up on, and really even Mikhail's talk, all the things he said he wasn't going to talk about. I think I want to go there and see. So I'll begin with a paradox, at least an apparent paradox. Across the vast expanse of more than 100 books, Alain Badiou never tires of reminding us that the single most imposing impediment to our subjective access to truths, to our finite yet substantial and materialist participation in the infinite, is the tyrannical domination of global social relations and subjectivity by the economic rationality of capitalism. In Number and Numbers, he writes, "Number governs the economy, and there, without a doubt, we find the determination in the last instance of its supremacy." And yet, he writes in Métaphysique du bonheur réel, who doesn't know that real happiness is incalculable? In the face of this overdetermined and seemingly universal untruth, the name that he steadfastly maintained for the political dimension of the true life is, of course, the idea of communism. For all that, though, I think you could assert with little exaggeration that Alain Badiou's engagement with the logical theoretician of the critique of political economy, with Marx, in other words, is in some sense an empty set. Not that Alain Badiou has ever failed to address Marx, but the repeated and attentive engagement, it seems to me, is addressed for the most part, almost entirely maybe, to the political Marx, the Marx of the Communist Manifesto, the Paris Commune, the Civil War in France. So that leads me to ask that if capitalism on the one hand constitutes, as Badiou has repeatedly affirmed, the dominant logic of our untrue world, and not merely a passing epiphenomenon, how can we hope to formalize the logic of the true life, of life subtracted from the reign of commodity fetishism and the domination of what Marx named with genius the sujet automate? How can we hope to do so without a systematic, formal construction of the categories and logic of the world of capitalism, without a contemporary, conceptually adequate formulation of the very logic that Marx spent the last 3 decades of his life constructing in the 3 incomplete volumes of Capital? So I say this as an open question and as the beginning of an inquiry, an invocation of a theoretical project, because it's my conviction, in fact, that Alain Badiou has now, in the 3 monumental volumes of Being and Event, in fact produced the materials for precisely such a logic. But as an arsenal in this context, an arsenal of concepts that remain to be precisely measured against Marx's critical and formal reproduction of capitalism, confronted with what Marx called his Gedankenkonkretum, a materialist, scientific thought concrete, the systematic exposition of which consumes the 3 volumes of Capital. Perhaps Alain Badiou is not simply that interested in developing in his own terms the systematic concatenation, formation, and derivation of the structural categories and logic of capital that Marx initiated. Perhaps, maybe as this quote suggests, he's particularly interested in the immanence of truths, maybe confirms in exploring truths rather than the specific logics of the world of capitalism. Anyway, in any case, in the few minutes that I have, I just want to try to sketch out a few suggestions, initial, tentative, of what could constitute a formal, let's say, translation of Marx's structural and categorical critique of political economy into terms adequate, perhaps ideally, to Badiou's philosophical system. So here's a little schema, again, very tentative, basic, of a sort of overall movement and parallel in thought between the 2, and I've just sort of sketched out an initial level of methodology where, of course, Marx had never wrote a logic, and we have only a very few brief suggestions, most famously the short 1857 introduction to the Grundrisse, and as well as a few comments, for example, in the postface to the 1873 edition of Capital. I think at least at an initial level, of course, Alain Badiou never stops exploring methodological problems as well, but there's already, I think, an initial formulation that maybe explores specifically the division between science and ideology in that period of 1960s formalism after reading Capital, Cahiers pour l'analyse, etc. And then distinguishing between being and event and logics of worlds, I think that one might draw a certain parallel between, on the one hand, a scientific exposition of being. The parallel isn't, I think, precisely exact with Capital, but I think there's a similarity. I think there's even a greater resemblance in the project of Logics of Worlds and the 2nd and 3rd volumes of Capital that are particularly addressed to the phenomenal forms of appearance of capitalism, but I think also one could say as an asubjective phenomenology. And then, of course, Marx has almost nothing to say concretely about the formalization of a true or a real life beyond capitalism. And of course, that's an area where Alain Badiou, with this latest volume, has an immense amount to say, as Jana indicated yesterday. So all this is very rudimentary, but maybe there are a few implications even from this we could draw. I think first, for Badiou and Marx, we can see that formalization is undertaken as a systematic negation of empiricist and narrative historicist forms of presentation. In other words, for both the scientific order and form of exposition, first being an event, then the asubjective logic of phenomenology of appearances, an appearance, is unrelated, even in inverse relation to the historical and phenomenal forms of appearance of worlds. Here maybe we can point to another first substantial formal parallel. Witness this dense opening paragraph of Badiou's 1967 contribution to Cahiers pour l'analyse, Mark and Lack on Zero. Epistemology breaks away from ideological recapture, reprise, in which every science comes to mime its own reflection, insofar as it excludes that recapture's institutional operator, the notion of truth, and proceeds instead according to the concept of a mechanism of production, whose efforts, by contrast, one seeks to explain through the theory of its structure. So I won't go through point by point a reading of that paragraph itself, but already I could say that this statement, for me, can easily be read as a sort of formal reduction of the very methodological program that Marx sketches out in that 1857 introduction. That's where Marx sets himself the project in what would become Capital, of breaking away from the recapture of political economy as the mere ideological articulation of the ideology of bourgeois capitalism, a theoretical recapture typical, Marx argues, of classical economics, Adam Smith. For Smith, even more than Ricardo, the theoretical articulation of a true image of capitalism was quite literally an empiricism based on the mere representation of the concrete. This entailed, for Adam Smith, an analytic process that sought to articulate abstract conceptual generalizations, but drawn from the phenomenological manifestations of capitalism. An abstraction based on the observed regularities of its universal features. The classic example of this procedure is Smith's famous assertion that there's a universal, transhistorical human propensity to barter and truck, Smith says. In contrast, Marx rejects both Hegelian idealism and the methodology of classical political economy alike as various methods of representation, mere representation of the concrete. In its place, and here I'm paraphrasing, maybe translating Badiou to Marx, refuses the logic of conceptual representation for a novel concept of a mechanism of production, whose effects, by contrast, Marx seeks to explain through the theory of its structure. That's the project of reading Capital, but one that I think is carried forward and immensely expanded and formalized across the span of Alain Badiou's work. At least that's one light in which that project, I think, can be read. In essence, this project, this methodology, is what Marx calls there in the 1857 introduction, the reproduction of a thought concrete, a Gedankenkonkretum. So here in Badiou's 67 formulation, truth, as in my example, Adam Smith's propensity to truck and barter, or even maybe the image of the magic hand these sorts of abstract concepts constitute the operator of ideological illusion and are to be replaced by Marx's structural logic, a logic, I'd argue, gestures beyond natural language, the natural language that for the most part Marx constructs his apparatus in, but it gestures, I think, toward what Badiou calls the systematic production of formal Marx. So, Anna Badiou's fundamental assertion in this early essay is that, quote, the concept of identity holds only for Marx. Logic never has recourse to any self-identical thing, even when thing is understood in the sense of the object of scientific discourse. Adam Smith certainly produced a scientific discourse on political economy, but Marx's critique reveals that Smith's analysis is an ideological representation of the mere forms of appearance of capitalism in their superficial regularity, that is, a universal propensity to barter and truck as a sort of observed empirical regularity, Smith claims. In other words, the putatively self-same concepts of classical political economy, the targets of Marx's critique, stand revealed as fetishized norms of appearance of the true objects that only conceptual critique can produce. The substance of value, abstract labor power, the general social form of relation that Marx names the value form. Quote, nothing here warrants the title of object. Here the thing is null. No inscription can objectify it. Within this space, one finds nothing but reversible functions from system to system, from mark to mark, nothing but the mechanical dependencies of mechanisms. So this formalism, unquote, this formalism radicalizes in mathematically grounded abstraction Althusser's initial reading of Marx's 1857 introduction in Reading Capital, where Althusser famously asserted the fundamentally conceptual nature of Marx's project. The historical figure, then, for Badiou's ultra-formalism, the thinker with whom he engages repeatedly across his work, in Mark and Lack, in Being and Event, again, in Number and Numbers, is Frege. Already the object of Badiou's critique in the 67 essay, the inventor of formal logic will become, in both the third meditation of Being and Event and the second chapter of Number and Numbers, the figure whose critique, the critique of whom, justifies Badiou's essential turn from logicism to an axiomatic of being as pure presentation of inconsistent multiplicity prior to all logic. What's striking to me in the context of this regularly repeated critique of Frege is the way in which Badiou's presentation of Frege can, I think, quite literally be read as a pure logical reduction and restatement of, for example, Marx's derivation of the concept of exchange value. Here's Badiou on Frege. To say that two concepts are equinumerate is to say that they have the same quantity, that their extensions are the same size, abstracting from any consideration as to what the objects are that fall under these concepts. So here, beside that formal statement of equinumeracy, is a famous passage, brief passage, of Marx's from the extended derivation of exchange value, from use value, in the opening chapter of Capital. I won't read the whole thing, but Marx formulates the equinumeracy of distinct use values, coat, linen, on what can be the basis of their equinumeracy. as an identical exchange value, etc. So if we had more time, we could show that in fact Frege's derivation of number from the postulate of equinumeracy, as Badiou presents it, strictly parallels Marx's language demonstration, natural language demonstration in Chapter 1 of Capital, of the exchange value, the relation of exchange value to use value, of these to the third concept that's value itself, and ultimately in this famous analysis of the absolute necessity of the money form, all of which carried out with impeccable rigor in Marx's natural language is itself of enormous complexity. Of course, the difference is that Frege, that Marx, like Badiou, are operating a critique of Frege, a critique of classical political economy. Frege is not operating in the same register. Instead, let me just suggest the possibility of such a comparison. If you look here at this schematic reduction, again from number and numbers, I don't have time to go through every step here, but I think if we followed it through, nearly at least, maybe every step in this process, this is the reduction of Frege's logical steps to get to the derivation of zero, as Badiou presents him. I think we could follow through these steps and formalize perhaps Marx's derivation of exchange value into a more logically reduced, let's say, form in which each step of derivation is indicated, beginning with an initial postulation of the concept of commodities as given, as a pre-existent Dasein in the famous first sentence of Capital, the wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails, appears as an immense collection of commodities, the first sentence of Capital. Next, the proposition that there are, in fact, commodities that fall under that concept. Then the extension of that concept of the commodity to name the set of all commodities, the assertion of the equinumeracy of all such concepts in their consistent multiplicity, differing quantities of use values that relate to one another as equivalent exchange values. Next, the set of concepts that is the consistent multiplicity of use values that fall under the concept of equinumeracy, etc., etc. More importantly, maybe than this sort of an exercise in formalization as translation, I think the passage from Badiou's initial writings in the 68 period to being an event in 88 leads into the heart of this Badiou-Marx relation that I'm interested in here. And I think the key moment in this development of Alain Badiou's thought is undoubtedly the conceptual decision and reorientation that constitutes the crucial turn in Badiou's thought. This is the axiomatic displacement and debasement of logical formalism from the primacy of logic's entitlement to legislate over being, a primacy classically sought after by Frege and Hilbert, to the unimpeachably secondary status of logic in strict subordination to the inaugural presentation of being as inconsistent multiple without a one. In a wonderful text that already was mentioned yesterday, Alain Badiou narrates this turn in his thought in the 2007 introduction to the re-edition of the concept of model. In the introduction, he describes how he moved from a focus on mathematics as the figuration of formal necessity via the systematic production of normative marks, a rejection of experimental empiricism, schematism, intuitionist idealism, how he moves from there to the affirmation of the unyielding priority of the axiomatic decision, of the pure, inconsistent multiple as the thought of being as such. In other words, he writes, I passed from a structuralist materialism, which privileged the letter, the mark, to an ontological materialism, privileging the evidence of the there is, the il y a, in the form of pure multiplicity. Here again, the resonance with Marx is, I'm convinced, astonishingly clear. Let's look again, think again of that famous first sentence. The wealth of societies in the capitalist mode of production in which it prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. In capitalist society, there are commodities. This is Marx's starting point, not a sensuous empirical thing, as though Marx took a break from his labors in the British Museum to walk out and touch a real economy as a sensuous thing. But this initial concept of capital's critique of political economy is a materialist given nonetheless, the concept of an immense accumulating mass of commodities, the concept that precedes and initiates the production of his theoretical critique. And from this initial fetishized, mystified concept, Marx proceeds to reproduce his thought concrete via this post-Hegelian critical method that he invented, the full conceptual apparatus and structure of capitalism in capital. For Marx, as for Badiou, an axiomatic decision necessarily precedes any and all logical apparatus of thought. For Marx, this axiomatization, of course, remains implicit. For Badiou, it becomes eminently explicit. However, for each, materialism emphatically triumphs over idealism. We find this axiomatic turn or reorientation of Badiou's thought at work, drawn and measured against the demonstrative force of Frege's logicism in that key, eloquent founding meditation number 3 of Being and Event. If meditation 1, as we discussed yesterday, sets forth the absolute necessity of inconsistent multiplicity, it does so in the philosophical register, in the rhetoric of natural language. Meditation number 3, in contrast, indexifies the necessity of inconsistent multiplicity, not only to Russell's paradox, a merely negative presentation of the limits of natural language, but to the actual proof of these limits in Gödel's proofs of completeness and incompleteness. Frege's effort to secure the concept of set, guaranteed by a well-constructed language, so that the control of language, of writing, would equal control of the multiple, unquote, founders on the shores of Russell's paradox. And this limit to a totalizing symbolic formulation is then formalized in the Platonist Gödel's proof of completeness, of incompleteness, the proof that every consistent formal system has a model, and the proof of the existence of arithmetically true but unprovable statements, the effective separation of the criteria for semantic truth from those of provability. Badiou draws the ontological implications of incompleteness with remarkable force, since given not only Russell's paradox, but above all incompleteness, quote, it's necessary to abandon all hope of explicitly defining the notion of set. Axiomatization is required such that the multiple, left to the implicitness of its counting rule, be delivered without concept, that is, without implying the being of the one. Even more strongly, we read in the concluding lines of Meditation 3 this grand summation of the ineluctable ontological conclusion to be drawn from incompleteness. The power of language does not go so far as to institute the there is of the there is. it confines itself to posing that there are some indications, there are some distinctions within the there is. So by now you won't be surprised if I say that this last statement returns us yet again to Marx, again demonstrating the unparalleled power of Badiou's logic to refound in adequately formal terms the critical method itself. For what, after all, is Zermelo's axiom of separation, if not the restrictive warrant of the symbolic to operate critically upon a necessarily prior given in its merely apparent totality, counted as one, to be counted as one. Under the aegis of separation, it's the case, Badiou tells us, that, quote, a property only determines a multiple under the supposition that there's already a presented multiple, unquote. There's always already a presented multiple prior to any counted as one, and if this is the case, the ontological necessity of Zermelo's axiom, separation, required to save the operations of first-order logic from the proof of incompleteness, does far more than simply logically necessitate the beginning of any critique from the prior givenness of a world, rather than the idealist engendering of existence from the loins of logic. The axiom of separation does even more, far more, that is, than merely certify the absolute necessity that the critique of political economy begin not from the absolute of an esoteric logical demonstration of the logical structure of capital as a closed, complete system, but that it begin from the most universal, immediate given, commodities in the givenness of their general plurality. Certainly, at a minimum, the axiom of separation tells us that in the capitalist mode of production, the appearance of the commodity is the appearance of capitalism as an immense mass of commodities in this world in which everything under the sun has its price. The world of commodities names a pure, perhaps the paradigmatic instance of a consistent multiple in which each is counted, everything has its price, but in subtraction from all and any specific determination of their singular forms, any of the specific determinate use values, that is, of various individual commodities. Use value, though necessary, is always secondary. From atom bombs to Zafra, the valorization of value is the universal logic of our world. No, even more than this 20th century demonstration of the absolute necessity that Marx begin critique from the simultaneously ontological and historical priority of commodities, the axiom of separation actually formalizes the critical procedure itself as formal necessity. What, of course, is critique if not precisely the operation of discerning, sorting, dividing, in a word, separating, that the axiom of separation formalizes as necessity. Here's Badiou. Language cannot induce existence, solely a split, scission, within existence. The logical requirement of an axiom of separation formalizes the critical operation as absolute necessity. Badiou writes in Number and Numbers, we can only move to an existence that's somehow carved out of a pre-given existence. We can separate in a given domain those objects within it that validate the property exposed by the concept. Critique in these terms is precisely the operation that Marx deployed as the systematic destruction of the fetishistic illusion of totality, of the illusion that there are, in other words, natural beings we call commodities, in the pure inviolability of their self-same identity. There are, in fact, only inconsistent multiples prior to the localized presentation of any one. Finally, then, I'm certain this is one of the most powerful conclusions to be drawn from a translation of Marx's critique into terms adequate to Badiou's logic of worlds. In the end, the priority of being is inconsistent multiplicity, confirmed and supported by its axiomatic separation from the demonstrative critique that is the power of language. This separation assures the priority of an ontological materialism against all Hegelian, but also Fregean idealism. Even today, half a century after Althusser, and especially, I think, fascinating is Pierre Macheret's contribution to reading Capital that has been largely overlooked. Althusser and Macheret's their critique of Marx's supposed recourse to Hegelian logic. Still today, books continue to pour forth demonstrating the persistence of Hegel in Marx's mature critical method. Okay. It's true that this exegesis can't be rejected out of hand, but it's, maybe for me anyway, a little depressing to think that a contemporary dialectical critique of political economy should remain captive to Hegelian idealism. Fortunately, the statement, every object is identical to itself, that invalid Leibnizian foundation of Frege's logical deduction of zero, isn't simply disputable, as Badiou says, for a hypothetical Hegelian. In distinction from Hegel, the axiom of separation grounds an explicitly, above all necessarily materialist notion of critique, one that demonstrably constitutes the materialist core of any idealist Hegelian remnants in Marx's critique of commodity fetishism. Marx, like Zermelo, operates within a strictly limited domain, the historically bounded world of capitalism, rather than any transhistorical, a priori concepts of labor, the human propensity to barter and truck, etc. Let me just say, in conclusion, there's more I could say about these various points of critique and Frege as well, but the final point is that last element in my little chart, which is the question of the real life and especially the capitalist real. These are two concepts that come together in two of Alain's most recent books, In Search of the Lost Real and Métaphysique du Bonheur Réel. And in the first, he puts forward not only the fundamental predominance of capitalism as an impediment in its determination of our world, also as a predominant impediment to a real life, a true life, but also the proper name for that real as the impasse, real understood in post-Lacanian terms as the impasse of formalization. He gives the name equality as the real of capitalism. I would say that that equality is rather maybe a subset of the real of capitalism, which I think more properly could be drawn from the name of that book in parallel, real life, true life, life itself, as the substance of capitalism, living labor, but in the impossibility of its actual incorporation within the system of capital, and rather its mere representation as abstract labor power. And instead, Michel Henry first proposed that life underlay capitalism. It was inassimilable within it, but I think that he took life as a sort of unexplained Husserlian ground. Whereas if we adopt Alain Badiou's notion of life as put forward in The End of Logics of Worlds, but also developed in these more recent books, I think then that life as something at the limit of the real of capitalism with equality as the proper name of its subset, that then real life could constitute the proper name for the real of capitalism. So let me just finish with this last quote. To think number restores us either through mathematics, which is the history of eternity, or through some faithful and restrained scrutiny of what's happening, to a supernumerary hazard from which a truth originates, always heterogeneous to capital, and therefore to the slavery of the numerical. It's a question at once of delivering number from the tyranny of numbers and of releasing some truths from it. It proceeds effectively and theoretically to the downfall of numbers, which are the law of the order of our situation. Thanks.
Thank you, Nick, for your presentation, and we'll have a discussion after all these three contributions.